just so we got the picture on the screen, and then stop sharing screen. Thank you. Welcome everybody to the first in a series of talks about the Bible's how the DLT, how the Bible can help us understand series. Tonight we're talking about the first in the series, which is Forgiveness with Frank Cottrell-Boyce. My name is Virginia Moffatt, and I'm the series editor. I'm also a writer myself, and I've written one of the guides, and we'll be talking about mine next week. And I live in Oxford, and I'm very, very pleased to introduce you to Frank Cottrell-Boyce, who is the writer we're talking about today. And Frank is probably known to many of you for his great screenplays. He's been writing for TV and for film for many years, and his credits include Brookside, Coronation Street, films such as Welcome to Sarajevo and Millions. And he's also a very well-known children's author, and I can testify to how good an author he is, because my son used to be a huge fan when he was at the age of reading Frank's books. And Frank's written some brilliant books: Millions, The Unforgotten Coat, Cosmic Broccoli Boy, and many more. And Frank also wrote the script for the 2012 Olympics. And his other claim to fame is that he co-hosts, that he was a member of the Keble College University Challenge in 2018, and amazed us all with his incredible skills, and I think got most of the points, I think. So that's who is going to be speaking to us today. We also have with us on the call Will Parks from DLT, and we also have David Maloney from DLT, who's the commissioning editor. So if you could spotlight on Will, Claire, so that Will is going to tell us a little bit about this series. So thank you.
Sure. Hi everyone. Thanks so much for coming out. So as Virginia said, the series is called How the Bible Can Help Us Understand. And I'll start with a quote from Pope Francis. He says, "The Bible is not a collection of books for the benefit of a privileged few. It belongs to those called to hear its message and to recognize themselves in its words." And the new How the Bible Can Help Us Understand series is designed to help us explore these words together for today. It's inspired by the revised New Jerusalem Bible, which was published by DLT in 2019. It's Henry Wansborough's new translation and rendering of the text from both the 1966 Jerusalem Bible and the 1985 Jerusalem Bible. And there are 4 books in the series to date, 3 of which have been published already, 1 of which is to come in the summer. The 3 which are available to buy now in pocket-sized paperback, I should stress with very readable text, and also as ebooks, are as follows. So we've got Frank Cottrell-Boyce's Forgiveness, which of course the conversation revolves around today. We've also got Virginia's book Approaching the End of Life. Virginia, as she mentioned, is the series editor, and that will inform next Wednesday's conversation at the same time, 7 o'clock. We've also released a 3rd book in August, which is Illness, Caring and Disability. And this is by Bernadette Meaden. She is a freelance writer who's contributed to many publications on political, social and religious. And in recent years, she's written extensively for Ecclesia on social justice issues, particularly welfare reform, and its impact on the poorest and most disadvantaged members of society. And that will be discussed on Wednesday, the 20th of January, by Virginia and with Frank's wife, Denise Cottrell-Boyce, who herself is the author of the 4th book in the series, which is going to be released later this year in July, and that's entitled Welcoming the Stranger. And that forms the 4th discussion in this series of discussions about the 4 books on Wednesday, 27th of January. In summary, each book in the series asks what the Bible has to say about an important aspect of our lives. They can be read privately or as part of a small study group. They're all 5 to 6 chapters long, in which or over which the authors offer their thoughts and questions for reflection, prayers and suggestions for considering the topic in question more deeply. And the guides in the series are aimed at ordinary people committed in their faith, interested in their faith, and wanting to live Christianly, but that haven't necessarily been brought up in a Bible studying tradition. And yeah, they've been designed to prompt intelligent thought, reflection, and guidance on some of the issues that really matter today. That's a sort of series overview there.
Thank you very much. Claire, could you just switch the spotlight again, please? Thank you. So yeah, I just thought before we start, I've just got a copy of the beautiful Jerusalem Bible, the Revised New Jerusalem Bible. And I was just thinking as you were talking, Will, that actually the last time we met and the last time I probably did anything in public was the launch of this book last year, just before lockdown in last March, I think it's the beginning of March. So it's really lovely to be here talking about this wonderful translation and this wonderful book. So without more ado, I think we should just launch into what we're talking about. What we've got is that, sorry, I've just got a bit distracted because the spotlight's not quite working. Claire, could you try spotlighting again? Sorry. What we've got for you is a series of questions I'm going to put to Frank. We've sort of prepared them and we had a bit of a chat on Sunday, and then there should be some time for people to chat later. And bear with us because this is the first time we've done this one, so we're just working out the technology, but I think everybody understands that Zoom can be a bit funny sometimes, can't it? So I'm going to kick off with my first question, and this we're going to put to every speaker that we talk at each week, which was that my thing? Sorry if that's a bit of feedback. That I'm going to ask if you could tell us, Frank, a little bit about your experience of the Bible through life and how writing this book has helped change your understanding. And if we could go to Frank now.
Right. Hi, everybody. Good to see you all. You know, I'm a Catholic. I'm kind of about as literate with the Bible as you'd expect a Catholic to be. We hear it read in installments through the year, and I do morning prayers, so I'm kind of aware of the Psalms. I had one kind of epiphanic experience when I wrote a play called God on Trial, and I was working with a rabbi called Dr. Jonathan Romaine, and I felt quite hesitant about this play because it's about putting God on trial and finding him guilty. And he said, well, that's because you're a Christian, and Christian prayer is basically please and thank you. And if you read the Psalms, wrestling with God is a strong tradition in Judaism. And so from then on, I've read the Psalms, so I'm quite familiar with the Psalms. And what I loved about them, what he pointed me towards, was that they're full of anger, they're full of frustration, they're full of yearning, and that the psalmist put the whole of themselves into the prayer. They're not polite. So there's rage in there and frustration, and I've found that a great comfort. So that's been the only bit that I've been really, really familiar with. Then writing the book, this little book, was so helpful to me because I thought I had in my head kind of the big stepping stones in the story of forgiveness. I knew that the prodigal son was going to be in there, and I knew that the woman taken in adultery was going to be there. I knew there were going to be bits of Leviticus in there, and I kind of knew what they were. But writing the book, I would go back to the context every time. And as a Catholic, when you hear the bits of the Bible, their context is maybe the feast or where they fall in the liturgical year, and not the context where they appear. And it was so enriching and so challenging to see them in the contexts. So, for instance, I'm going to read you this because this might be me, but I found it kind of funny as well. But looking at the story of the prodigal son, which I love, and which of course he tells after a visit to a Pharisee. So the whole sort of question of law and justice is very much on the table, which you don't get when you're just hearing the story by itself. So I kind of went back to Deuteronomy and looked at stuff about fathers and sons, and what would the audience, that first audience for the prodigal son, be expecting from that story when a son comes to his father and says, this farm that you've built up over the years, which you're intending to bequeath to generations to come, I want a piece of it, you know, I want to diminish it forever. How do you feel about that? And I mean, even now, you know, my wife is from a farming family in Sligo. I know what land means. But so I looked it up in Deuteronomy, and this is what it says in Deuteronomy. I'm sorry if you don't find this funny. I kind of do find it funny. Deuteronomy chapter 21. If someone has a stubborn son who will not listen to the voice of the father or the mother, and even when they punish him, will not pay attention, the father and the mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of the town at the gate of the place. And to the elders of the town they will say, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious and will not listen to us. And then the fellow citizens shall stone him to death. It's like, it doesn't even say go into any detail. It doesn't even require detail. It's just stubborn. That's enough. So that, like, the measure of how shocking. I mean, I'm not saying that people in first century Jerusalem completely took Leviticus or Deuteronomy literally, but that's the kind of cultural background that story is told in. And it really kind of brought home to me what a shocking story that is. And time again, I would find that going back to something that I thought was familiar and looking at it in its context or cross-reference, it really, really enriched it for me and brought it to life for me. I mean, I suppose that's obvious, but it was great privilege to do this, actually. It was very enriching.
I would sort of say, as the editor, it was a great privilege to edit as well. And I think what I loved about this book, particularly, you did tell the stories, but you give us this really great context. And again, I didn't know a lot of that context, so I did find that very funny when I read it. And there's lots of bits I really laughed out loud when I was editing this book. It was a real joy to edit. So that was one of the places I did. We gave you kind of free rein and sort of said, you know, choose a topic, because we so wanted you to be part of this series, Frank. So what was it about forgiveness that you chose forgiveness as a topic for this guide? What was it about that subject that drew you?
Oh, well, a very personal thing, which is that I'd written a film called The Railway Man, which was about Eric Lomax, who'd been a prisoner on the Burma Railway in the Second World War and had been tortured. And the experience had traumatized him for the whole length of his life. And in the end, he found his torturer and thought, I have to confront him. And, you know, Eric said, well, my intention was to do him harm. So in his head, he was living this kind of revenge story of some sort. And then when they met, there was this immediate kind of, well, to me, an outpouring of grace, but something happened between the two of them that made it possible for Eric to forgive Nagasi and to let go of all this hurt. So, and in the end, the film was not a great movie, but it took like 10 years to make that movie. So for those 10 years, Eric was in my life. So it was something that I thought about from somebody else's point of view. But also I began to notice that when the apostles talk about Jesus, when you know, after he's gone in the Acts of the Apostles or whatever, or Paul, or the letters of Paul, and people are saying, what was that all about? They don't ever talk about miracles or eloquence. They just say he came for the forgiveness of sins. And it's like, that really struck me, that the core of it all is forgiveness. That's what it's for. You know, if you ask Peter what was it about, he would say it's about the forgiveness of sins, and he would know, you know, because even in that tiny account that we have of him, there are huge sins that he commits. He assaults somebody with a dagger, he betrays Jesus. And so that story about accepting our flaws and moving on from them seems to me the core of it. And then also, as soon as I started to work on this, I said to you, of course we've got online things now, so we can do searches. And if you look in the whole Bible for forgiveness, there isn't very much. You know, it's not. Having said that, you know, for Peter and for the apostles, that's the core. If you look at it in the context of scriptures, it comes in very late. And it seemed to me, like, as a storyteller, that the whole story of the winding quest of our relationship with God was building up to this idea of forgiveness, which, when you look at it, is actually a very complicated and not a simple thing at all, not an easy thing, which, you know, is captured in. I'll just wrap it on. I'll let Virginia ask the next question.
Yeah, no, well, I think that's really helpful, and I think when I was reading it again, I was really struck when you said there's not very much forgiveness in the Bible, and it's like, what do you mean? But then I think, as you say, it is later that is what we're leading up to, and I think what this book does really well is show the complexity of forgiveness. And I think I'm going to start with the first story that you mentioned, and it is, in some ways, it's kind of an obvious starting point because it is such a familiar story, the story of the prodigal son. But I like what you bring to it in your kind of analysis of it, and how you kind of frame it, but also I hope you'll also tell us a little bit about when you went out to Twitter and you asked people what they thought about the prodigal son, because we're supposed to think something. So I didn't prepare that, but I think we're supposed to sort of think something about this story, and actually we focus so much on the prodigal son, we don't always focus on the other people in the story. But if you could just kick us off with that story, and why do you think it's important?
Oh, I mean, just again, as a writer, I was always going to start with this because I think it's the most perfect story. I mean, I think Hemingway said Hemingway said of the story of the prodigal son, that the last line of the prodigal son is the most beautiful thing written down, you know, and he ran to him, which is incredibly radical. You know, I just read out what the father should have been doing. It's just such a beautiful story, and it's tiny, and yet it leaves you more conflicted than War and Peace does, or any great, hulking great work of art. And Virginia said, so when I was writing this, I went on Twitter and said, what do people think about the story of the prodigal son? And it's, yeah, I mean, you're probably going to have some of the same reactions yourselves. I always thought it was unfair when I was growing up, that then ended up in a very similar situation at home, and now it makes me furious. It's all wrong. Stuff that wastrel. It made me think of my youngest sister hissing at me en masse mid-gospel when I was home one weekend from uni. And she said, "That's mum and dad when you come home. We hate you." And when I first heard it as a child, I remember feeling angry and upset that the message was basically hard work doesn't matter, and I don't like that. And it really brings, like, it. I mean, I completely get those reactions. I'm very much the older brother in that story. You know, that's who I identify with, and I've had to think about that a lot. But I mean, I started with it because I wanted to flag up that forgiveness is completely counterintuitive. Forgiveness, which I think we haven't defined yet, we should talk about what forgiveness is. But the fact that it is such a radical idea, and we talk about it a lot, and we have these kind of superstar forgivers like Eric Lomax, or people who've forgiven the people from the Holocaust or whatever, these huge, huge acts of forgiveness. But it is incredibly difficult to do, and it's quite complicated to define what it is. And I think no story really brings home the hardness of forgiveness as the way the prodigal son does, because it leaves everybody feeling conflicted and feeling sorry for the older boy. And the fact that there's kind of almost as much space given to him as there is to the prodigal. You know, the story starts, there was a man who had two sons. But even the story is called The Prodigal. It's like the bad one gets all the notice, you know. So it was always going to start with that, I think. And it's just that thing about, as a storyteller, as I found out trying to make that movie, these are very, very hard stories to tell, because they don't, well, for instance, even the short version of The Prodigal Son ends with such a conflicted feeling in the audience. They're very hard stories to tell, because this is not the shape of a story. Forgiveness stories are stories in which we think nothing happens, because our definition of a story is something is finished with, and forgiveness is always a beginning. There's a widely quoted remark of Chekhov's, you know, if you show a gun in Act 1, it has to be fired in Act 3. And that's the shape of any story that you want to tell, whether it's Hamlet is shaped like that, every single episode of Thomas the Tank Engine is shaped like that. The deepest human desire is that your enemies will get theirs, you know? And even now, we were talking about this the other night, Virginia and I, that we live in what's supposedly a secular age, but I see millions of people casually believing karma, in that idea that what goes around will come around. And that's almost like a provision of the universe, that the universe will get its revenge. Revenge is very deeply ingrained in us, or payback is deeply ingrained in each of us. So the prodigal confronts that and says, what are you going to do about it? And it's such a challenge, that story. So that's why I started with the prodigal.
I think that's a really wonderful explanation. And I think you sort of said, you know, what is this thing called forgiveness? And I think the next story you address in the book is the woman caught in adultery, which is another really challenging story. And again, I love the way you frame it and you make this into such a drama in the book. And I think even your chapter title, the woman in the dust, and I think the chapter title, The Prodigal, is the boy who ran. They're just really great kind of little elements of the story that you kind of bring out. And I think in what I really liked about The Woman Caught in Adultery was you have a discussion about Mosaic law and judgment and justice, and that kind of links to these ideas of revenge and also this ideas of punishment of trauma, and then there's this forgiveness in the middle of it. So perhaps you could explain a little bit how you think those ideas kind of interact and why forgiveness is so radical in the light of that story.
Yeah, okay, so there's a couple of things there. First of all, that remark that I made earlier about going back to context, if you look at the context of the incident of the woman taken in adultery, it's the build up to it is that he's just kind of infringed Sabbath law by curing someone on the Sabbath. So the law is in play, you know, as a thing. And I thought I should think about what that is. So I again went back, as I did with the prodigal son, to see what the law was. And the law is so precise about, and the story itself is so precise. She's caught in the act of adultery. And the Mosaic law is just absolutely cut in stone. It's very clear that she should be executed, and incredibly precise, really precise. You know, like if you go back, it's like literally like what day of the week, who's doing what to whom, under what circumstances, what exactly is the marital status of the man, all these other things. Like, and reading it, I felt this kind of outpouring of sympathy, because you could feel in the Mosaic law the strain of a society trying to contain its own violent appetites. You know, I'm very aware of revenge stories, and the great saying about revenge is, let he who seeks revenge remember to dig 2 graves. That revenge escalates. So these pedantic, super precise laws, like an eye for an eye, they're there to try and limit that appetite. They seem vengeful to us, but I think there's also like, you do this and that's an end. You know, it's not, your family is now not going to get into a McCoy type feud that's going to last for generations and blight everybody. This happens and then it's done. So you could feel the weight of the law, and I felt a kind of sympathy there for the first time in my life. And I also understood that what was going on here was, one of the things that's going on is that the law is a trap as well, because the Mosaic law demands execution, but they're living under Roman occupation, so only the Romans are allowed to execute people. So you are in this incredible bind about like your Jewish identity, your faith identity, and your identity as a citizen, and there's all this stuff going on. So that was very enriching to find that out, which I kind of cover. And then I kind of looked at like other versions of it. And there's a story that's told a lot, and nearly every retelling of it, including quite modern ones, like if you look at The Last Temptation of Christ, there's always this, the retellings of it always sort of play it as though in some way Jesus has outsmarted them. You know, that he's come up with something that they can't answer, and that he's clever and he's outwitted them. In The Last Temptation, there's a kind of sense that when Jesus bends down to write, he's writing down the sins of all these hypocrites in the crowd. And I just thought, well, if you take that idea away that they're hypocrites, these are just people trying to do their best. Where is that going to take you? Where is that thought going to take you? Because they're not portrayed in that way in the story. And I kind of looked hard at that story and thought, I mean, I came across a great essay by Hannah Arendt, who was trying to define what forgiveness is and what is going on here. There's justice and forgiveness. So in the Prodigal Son, you've got a kind of confrontation between forgiveness and family obligations and loyalties. And in the woman taken with adultery, you've got a kind of confrontation between justice, which it feels to us like rough justice, but they were doing their best, they think, you know. So there's a kind of justice going on and forgiveness. And what is the difference between those two things? And I read this Hannah Arendt essay in which she talks about the difference between mercy and forgiveness. And she talks about mercy as an imperial virtue, that mercy sort of lets people off, and it's mercy, you know, it's a magnanimous gesture by the leader to allow people to go free, which, you know, is impressive in some ways. But she says, this is equally dismissive of, this is every bit as dismissive of the individual as an execution would be. It's just, it's like, you know, you are here for me to demonstrate my power. It might be to chop your head off, or it might be to let you go. Either way, you know. And forgiveness is a very different thing. And it's in that story that I think you begin to confront what a complicated, difficult concept forgiveness itself is. And as ever, Jesus does it by using himself. It's not the words. So he makes himself vulnerable. He writes in the sand, which I again, as someone with an eye for kind of the poetic detail, that I find that riveting, that tiny gesture. If you accept that Jesus is God, well, God writes with his hand in the Bible. He writes the 10 Commandments, and he writes, you've been weighed in the balance and found wanting to Nebuchadnezzar. So he passes down these judgments. Jesus writes in the sand, and we don't know what he wrote. He's just doodling in the sand. And I looked at this amazing picture by Bruegel, which I think Virginia's going to share with you. There's lots of representations of this story in art, and almost without exception, they are basically soft porn. They're an excuse to show a woman in disheveled clothing with a lot of men looking down at her. And, you know, they're erotic. They're mostly erotic. But in this one, I hope everyone can see it, it's Jesus who's bending down, and he just is completely vulnerable. I mean, that's the pose of somebody about to be executed. You know, he could be being beheaded. And for me, really thinking about forgiveness starts in that moment of silence and putting yourself in a vulnerable position, or God putting himself in a vulnerable position. And so this is the story that made me think about how forgiveness is beyond mercy and beyond justice. And it is actually always going to be quite hard to articulate what it is.
Thank you. And thanks for sharing that, Claire. I think that picture really does speak volumes. And I love the fact, as you say, it's not the kind of erotic one we usually see. It's very, very sober, really.
And the ending of that story is that he says, "Has no one condemned you?" And she says, "No." And he says, "Well, neither do I. Go and sin no more." Right?
Yeah.
So he says very little, but he does issue this challenge. You know, he says, "Go and be better." And it's that, I think that on a human level, as opposed to an intellectual level, what really came home to me there was that forgiveness is not, the reason that it's hard to write forgiveness stories is that forgiveness is a beginning and not an end.
Excellent. And moving on from that, the next sort of bit of the Bible you were looking at was, I was quite struck when I was editing this series that all four of us were drawn to Job. And I don't think that's a coincidence, because I think the subject matters we're all looking at have some really difficult bits. Forgiveness is hard, as we talked about. There's a lot of pain in forgiveness. End of life is hard. living with illness and disability can be hard, being a refugee can be hard. And so I think Job, out of all the characters in the Bible, is one I really identify with, because he really gets it. And like you said about the psalmist being angry, Job doesn't really get angry, but he just really goes into the depths of pain and difficulty and despair. And it was only reading your book that I realized that actually this all started because God had a bet with Satan, which is just a really terrible thing to do to Job, and Job still loves God at the end of it, which I kind of think, well, you know, did God deserve Job's love? But one of the things I think you really bring out is, one, that Job can speak to us about forgiveness in pain, but also at the end there's this amazing prose poem that I've never come across before, which is a sort of praise of God. And so I just would like to hear a little bit more about both those things, why you chose this bit of Job and that end poem as well.
For Job, like that thinking about Job grew out of thinking about the woman in adultery, because what I really focused on about the woman in adultery was the lack of an argument, you know, the lack of a discursive explanation about why one should forgive ethically or anything like that. Just this silence and this vulnerability and this acceptance. And I mean, I find it very hard to. Victor Hugo called the Book of Job the greatest masterpiece of the human mind, and part of its mastery is that you can't render it down into meaning. It's got this sort of hypnotic rhythm, and I wondered if part of kind of hope and balance and dealing with things is rhythmic. You know, if you think of Ecclesiastes, there's a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to reap and a time to sow, and that this balancing of things seems so powerful. And in Job, it's just, for me, the attraction of Job is less the story than that huge canticle at the end, where it just sort of forces you into a kind of quietness and an opening of your soul. Shall I just read a bit? When Job can't explain how he's come to terms with things, he says, "Can you guide the crown in its season and show the bear and its cubs their way? Have you grasped the laws of heaven? Could you make their writ run upon the earth? Can your voice carry to the clouds so that the waters may cover you? Will lightning flashes come at your command and answer, here I am? Who endowed the ibis with wisdom and gave the cockerel intelligence? Who has the wisdom to number the clouds and tilt the water skins of heaven until the soil runs into one mass? Do you go hunting prey for the lion? Do you satisfy the hunger of the lion when it crouches in its den, lying in its lair? Who provides the raven when its nestlings cried out? Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Have you watched the deer in labor? Have you ever counted the months that they carry their young? Do you know where they give birth? It's just amazing, all that stuff about, you know, can you pull up Leviathan with a pin? Do you know where the snow and the hail are stored? And it's just this kind of massive opening of human potential, of potential, and this opening of these vast vistas that are beyond justice and ethics.
It is really wonderful, and I'm so glad you introduced me to it. So I do recommend you read that bit of the book, because I just thought that is just an amazing bit of Job.
I think maybe emotionally what it's about is like not counting the cost. And that is what you're going to have to do to forgive. You're going to have to just weather that storm, you know, and count that cost and say, okay, let's move on, you know.
That neatly sort of takes us into the kind of stories of Eric Lomax, who you mentioned at the beginning, and Eva Kaur, who was a victim of Mengele, because one of the questions that we're kind of looking at in this book is, you know, sometimes forgiveness is a really big ask. It's a big ask for Job. It was a really big ask for Eric. It was a big ask for Eva. So how do you think Eva and Eric were able to come to a position where they could forgive?
I mean, these are the superstar forgivers, aren't they? Eric and Eva Kaur is someone who forgave her concentration camp guard. I don't know. I think I've worked hard to kind of figure out what the mechanics of it are, and I can tell you therapeutically what the mechanics of it were for Eric, because Eric had worked with Helen Bamber, who was one of the founders of the Institute for the Victims of Torture, and who had been with people when she, as a young I think she was kind of a nurse, like she was some kind of medical thing. She was among the first people into Belton, I think, when it was liberated. So she'd seen that close up. And her thing was that there has to be a kind of exchange of places, that the victim has to have a moment of power and to relinquish that. So I think when Eric confronted Nagasi, who was his torturer, Eric said this, these are human things, but Eric said it was the first time he'd realized how small he was. He said, and in the first instance, that only intensified the irritation that I felt that this big Scottish soldier had been tortured by this tiny little Kemper type. So there's that kind of, there's that moment, I think, becomes a very important one, that there's a moment when the victim has an ability to do something that is withheld. So I got very interested in the mechanics of forgiveness, which are very different from justice. In justice, I think what happens is that it's taken out of your hands, that the state is going to provide, or the judge is going to provide, or your community is going to sort that out. And the conflict between two people is removed from those two people. But in forgiveness, it's between those two people. So forgiveness has to be offered and accepted. It has to be accepted. It has to be asked for. So it's a transactional thing. So that, like, I think I used, and again, just going back to why do this, that the map of all that, the kind of complicated mechanics of it all that Helen Bamber explained to me from her background as a, in psychotherapy and having been to concentration camps and worked with the victims of torture, it's all perfectly mapped out in stages in the story of Joseph and his brothers, who do this terrible thing to him. He escapes, he gains power, he has power over them. And he kind of sadistically uses that power for a little bit. There's a beat of the story that's often missed out, that he sends for Benjamin. And they think, well, if we are going to starve unless we hand over our youngest as a hostage. And then it's all given back. Do you remember he puts a cup in there and accuses them of theft and all this stuff? So he has this moment of power, which is what Eric had over Nagasi. And the Eva Kaur thing is, people don't know the story of Eva Kaur, that I've forgotten the name of the officer, but he was on trial for war crimes and she'd been in the concentration camp. And she famously at the trial walked across the court floor and formally forgave him. And I think she kissed him, she hugged him, which is astounding. But it's also in a legal context, isn't it? There's a platform and all the appurtenances of power are actually on either side at that moment. So that the sort of mechanics of it was interesting and amazing to me, that they're all perfectly laid out in Genesis, in the story of Joseph, and very useful to have that story in your mind when you're dealing with these things, I think.
Yeah, no, I'd forgotten that bit about Benjamin until you pointed it out, and that is very cruel. But
it's really harsh,
harsh, but also it's kind of the way it turns around is really fantastic. And if you stay with us for the 4 weeks of school, we'll be returning to Joseph at the end, because Denise talks about Joseph in the context of the immigrant community, which I think is really an interesting later stage of that story.
Oh yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah. And so we're on to my last question, and after I've asked this question and Frank's answered it, we will be able to start taking messages in the chat, so start thinking about your questions. We sort of roughly said about an hour for this, but if people are willing to sort of stick on the call for a little bit longer, just so that we get through every question, you're very welcome to. So my last question is, I hadn't really thought, when we were talking about doing this event, we were originally thinking about doing it in Advent. And then Christmas just came upon us and it was too quick. So we moved it to January, and I hadn't really thought, but today is of course the Epiphany, and we are still in the Christmas season, but we are also looking forward to Lent, which is kind of the next big part of the church's year. And it always strikes me how quickly we go from Christmas to Easter. It's a very short part, and then the rest of the year there's kind of 9 months before we get back to Christmas again. And I always feel in the Epiphany story that we've got the message about what's happening, what's going to happen next, in the fact that the 3 wise men bring myrrh, frankincense and gold, and of course myrrh is what is used for burial rituals. So right in that moment when we're celebrating the birth of Jesus, we're being told, actually, this story is not going to end well. Jesus is going to end on the cross, and it's an agonizing death on the cross. And yet Jesus, at his moment of death, says, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. And so I just wanted to go on as a last question to kind of ask, you know, this is really revolutionary. So can you tell us why it's so revolutionary, and what do you think it means for us as Christians that this is what Jesus left us with?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just thinking about the three. We sing carols throughout Advent, and whenever anyone does the Three Kings, that third verse, Mary's mind is bitter perfume, leaves a light of gathering gloom. Every time anyone sings it, one smart aleck kid always goes, "Yeah, Merry Christmas." And because it's true, it's like it's shadowed there from the beginning, isn't it? It's there from the mare is there, the tomb is there from the beginning. I mean, it's just this huge reversal, isn't it? That you have a God who's going to die. I mean, that is the central scandal, astounding transaction at the heart of Christianity, is that instead of a God that you sacrifice to, there will be a God who is your sacrifice, and that is for forgiveness. And I find that kind of amazing. And I, you know, about half the book is about that. I mean, two things. One is just to go back to kind of this idea that forgiveness is a beginning, that one of the most amazing kind of things that stayed in with me as an image is from Pilgrim's Progress, when Christian, who's carrying this enormous physical burden, which I always find moving, because Bunyan was a tinker and walked the country with this massive bag of pots and pans on his back to get to, you know, to feed himself, and how exhausted and how he really knew the pain of carrying a massive weight. And that in Pilgrim's Progress, he comes to the cross and it falls off his back and rolls away down the hill. And I always kind of almost tear up when I hear that bit of the story, and went to look it up for this book thinking that's the amazing ending of Pilgrim's Progress. And I often say to people, that amazing ending of film, it's not the ending at all. It's like 20 pages in. I don't know if I stopped reading or what, but it's barely the beginning of the book. It's one of the first things that happens to him. And so that idea of it being a beginning is very powerful. And that thing, you know, that kind of huge role reversal, it's very hard to articulate. So I just thought, shall I read you a bit? This is actually not by me. This is a long quote in the book from Denise, who wrote one of the other books. So this is a trailer for week 4. But she wrote this: when we walk into a church, the first object you'll see is a young man dying a slow and painful death. If you're trying to sell a religion, it's a funny place to start. When Jesus stands in front of Pilate at his trial, Pilate says, "Truth, what is that?" The crucifix is truth on many levels. It represents the truth of pain, the truth of presence, and the presence of pain. Pain exists. God has experienced it, knows what suffering is. He will not leave you alone to suffer if you ask him to be with you. The truth of the cross is that sin is pain. Sin is an energy which can never be used up. It just gets transferred. That's the idea behind karma. What goes around comes around, which sounds quite good to human sensibilities. It sounds fair. But what it amounts to is an endless cycle of pain, carried on from generation to generation and on into infinity. On the cross, Jesus breaks the cycle by breaking himself. His broken body says, "No, the book stops here. I will take it. Lay your guilt and your vengeance on me. Your spiteful guilt and your petty spiteful vengeance. Right and vengeance. Whatever the origin of the pain you suffer or the pain you inflict, let it end here." And I think that's amazing, you know? So that, like, she said it much better than I can.
Thank you. I think that's a really, really good place to end. And thank you for all your insights. And I don't think we managed to touch on everything, but we did touch on quite a lot of the book. But just to sort of say again, this is a very, very lovely little book. It's very quick read, but it's really, really packed with really great stuff. So please do get that. And we've got our first question from Will, which is, what role does anger play in forgiveness?
Oh my God. I wrote a little bit about anger in this because the other stormy side of Jesus is the turning over the tables in the temple. I think it's right to be angry, isn't it? I mean, Eric was angry. It was anger that took him all the way to Thailand to find his torturer. It was that unbearability of what he was carrying. So I think anger can be the fuel that takes you to the line. It's not, again, what I was saying about the Psalms, that there is a place for this, that forgiveness is an embracing of all the complications of our nature. And that does include anger, I think. I think there is space for it.
Lovely. And then we have a question from Deborah. How can we encourage forgiveness at the moment when everyone is quick to blame others for breaking COVID rules? That's a nice
or anything. I mean, I think that the reason, I didn't say this, but like one of the reasons that I was drawn to it was that it seems to be a virtue that we're not embracing at all at the moment. That every kind of every political debate at the moment seems to be not just divisive, but kind of ossifying, that you are either, or to the point where it becomes part of your identity. So you're either a Brexiter or a Remainer. You either believe in Trump, or you don't believe in Trump. You believe in global warming. They become articles of belief, and that should not be the case about things like trade treaties. Do you know what I mean? A trade treaty should not be part of your identity, one way or the other. Like that whole. So I mean, I don't have an answer at all, but I do think forgiveness is something we should start to talk about. And an aspect of it that I haven't mentioned tonight, and we haven't mentioned tonight, is yes, anger's got a part, but a really, really important part of forgiveness is forgetting. We say forget and forgive and forget. And in fact, one of the things that Eric Lomax was dealing with was that the actual motto of the ex-services association that he belonged to was never forgive, never forget. And never forget is kind of a virtue. It's very difficult to allow people to forget now that we live in this digital age, when every youthful indiscretion has left, every intemperate moment has left its trace and can be found up and dragged up and held against you, and that we've all become each other's recording angels. And we all have evidence for and against each other. And so that's a unique challenge that we have to face at the moment, that we are compiling evidence against each other all the time.
Sorry, I just muted myself. We've got another question, which is in the Prodigal Son, this is from G, the youngest son realizes what he has done. Is this a requirement of forgiveness, the self-realization, or is forgiveness freely given?
I mean, I think for the forgiver, it can be freely. I think that's a very tough question. I've been talking to Neville Lawrence recently, who's the father of Stephen Lawrence, and he really struggles as a Christian, or has really struggled as a Christian, with the idea of forgiveness precisely because they have never ever shown a moment of remorse. So it's very difficult for him to forget. And I do think part of the mechanics of forgiveness is that you have to be asked for it. You can't give it to someone who doesn't want it, which is part of the mechanics of love, isn't it? It's knock and the door shall be opened. You do have to knock at the door. He's waiting behind the door. He's desperate to open it for you, but you have to knock to let him know you're there. So I think that is part of that what I was saying was the mechanics of it. And for Neville Lawrence, it's been a question of forgiving himself first for his anger, and for allowing them to dominate his life in this way. So I'm stumbling and becoming inarticulate, and I hope that that's clear. And it's because forgiveness is not, the vocabulary of forgiveness does not come naturally to us.
Yeah,
it's a very complicated process, and we don't really have the mechanics of it, and therefore grace is very important.
And this sort of second question sort of kind of links to that from Steve, which is, forgiveness is a transaction. Is forgiveness possible if it isn't received or accepted?
Well, I think it's possible. Like talking to Neville Lawrence, it is. He has been able to move on. And the moment that we were hedging up against there is the crucifixion, and Jesus saying, Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. So there is a path there to moving on from being sinned against. But if you want to be forgiven, you have to ask, definitely.
Thank you. I don't know if anybody else has got more questions, but one of the things I just wanted to reflect, which sort of links back to the Japanese thing, and it was a story I was telling you the other day, which it really struck me from the Eric Lomax story. And one of the things I'm really aware of is how harsh the conditions were in Japan. I think the Japanese prisoners of war were treated so badly, and I think even to this day people still feel very, very angry about it. And one of the experiences I had in my life that really was very a profound one for me was I was once in Preston at a trial of some peace activists, and we went and we were leafleting outside the War Memorial. With us were some nuns, and one of them was Japanese, and they're Buddhist nuns, and they tend to go to peace trials, and their witness is basically that they pray with prayer drums, and they chant and they pray, and they're on their knees. And on this occasion, because we were at the War Memorial, somebody I think was very upset by this image of a praying nun who's Japanese by the War Memorial when they had a family member who had been treated appalling by the Japanese. And so this woman came and she just screamed at Yuko, who's this tiny little Japanese nun who'd never done anybody any harm, but basically got all this anger from this woman. And one of my friends, Mill, sort of spoke to the woman, and she basically talked until her anger was done. And afterwards I said to Yuko, well, you took that, even though it wasn't really your fault. And Yuka said, well, I just felt I had to absorb it. And I just wondered, I mean, I have no idea how that woman felt afterwards, but do you think something like that is part of this process of just being able to let your anger at somebody and to somebody to receive it, even if it's not the right person?
No, definitely. We go back to that thing about the Psalms as well, that your anger has its place. And I think like one of the difficult things for Eric's comrades from Burma was the fact that their pain was not seen. You know, they were a defeated army that were brought back to a victorious country. Nobody wanted to hear their stories. And so they kept their stories to themselves. But if you do that, then that kind of resentment builds up and up and up and up and doubles down on the pain and the injustice that you've already had. So they had like decades of festering of, you know, festering unacknowledged hurt, and they had nowhere to say it, you know, while Japan became this superpower.
Yeah, that must have been very hard. We've got a question here, and perhaps it's from Keith and I think it's Keith and Margaret, or Mary, I can't quite see, saying, what about the Lord's Prayer? Keith, could you perhaps say what you mean by that? You could unmute yourself to ask that question. So I'm not quite sure what you mean by what about.
In the meantime, someone else, Hugh, has put that quote from Luke 17, which I think is great. I should have remembered it. If your brother or sister sins against you, rebuke them, and if they repent, forgive them. So it's always like the beginning of it is always transactional, I think. It is a complicated process.
Hi, this is Keith. Yep. Just one of the petitions in the Lord's Prayer, and there aren't many, is forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And I wondered what your reflection was on that and its inclusion in that vital prayer.
Yeah, I mean, like everything you need is in that prayer, and as it appears in that prayer there's a mechanics, isn't there? It's a contractual thing. Forgive us as we are forgiven. You know, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those. So you will be forgiven in exact proportion to how much you can forgive. And I think the kind of one of the things that Christianity gives you, I hope, is an awareness that you may have sinned a lot more than you know. You know, that other people might, as hurt as you are, you may well have hurt a lot of other people, knowingly or unknowingly, either by, you know, the way we live, our political system, the injustice that we live in, or just by being human. You know, that one of the other non-biblical stories that I quote there is this thing from the Arabian Nights about the genie and the fig stone, who is about a merchant who sits down and eats some figs and throws a stone over his shoulder. and from then on is blasted by this genie because unwittingly this fig stone has blinded the genie's eye. So we do damage all the time just by existing. So that I think that transactional thing in the Lord's Prayer is really powerful.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Dan's asking, why is the prodigal son only in one gospel?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm just glad it is there.
We've probably got time for just one more question, I think, or maybe two, if somebody's quick, if anyone's got anything burning they want to say. The slight trouble with Zoom is you're kind of waiting for somebody to type something. If somebody's thinking, if you're thinking of something, I think what we'll just do for the last kind of 5 minutes, and then if one person comes up with a great question, we'll answer that as it is. One of the things we've done in these books is David, when he commissioned them, said it would be really good if we kind of put some cultural context in, and Frank, you did that a great deal in your book anyway, because you just bring in film and art and literature into each of the chapters, but at the end of each chapter and at the end of the book we have got some references to kind of books and films and art that kind of relate to the topics under discussion. So before we finish, I just wondered if you could just mention a couple that you wanted to people to think about, to leave us with.
Oh gosh, should have got on top of this more, shouldn't I? I mean, the prodigal son is like, I'm kind of obsessed with that story. So I'd written, this sounds like I'm plugging my own work now, but I wrote a comedy film that's kind of a thinking about the prodigal son called Sometimes Always Never, with Bill Nighy in. So, you know, I come back to that. What did we look at? What did we think about? Well, Pilgrim's Progress was another thing that for me was very powerful. I mean, my mind's gone blank, Virginia. I'm so sorry.
Don't worry. We've got one more question. We've got one question, and maybe you can think. I've got a couple of books that I would have wanted to flag up, and I just have to say I haven't seen the Sometimes Always Never film, but that's the one about Scrabble, isn't it? And I really want to see it. It sounds really amazing.
Well, it's about Scrabble, but it's about a boy who goes missing and how that missingness overshadows everything else. And it's the prodigal son is quite a big thing in that story. I would like to flag up a little known short story by Ernest Hemingway, which kind of also sparked up me. I can't remember what it's called now, but it's very funny, and it's a story about a man who puts an advert in the paper in Spain and says, "Pedro, come back, all is forgiven, signed your father." And he says, just come to the what does he say? He says, come to the Hilton Hotel in Barcelona, 2:00 on Friday. All is forgiven, your father. And when he gets there, there's like 300 boys called Pedro who all feel that their father needs to forgive them.
Fantastic. Well, there's one last question, and then I'm just going to mention my recommendations. And if you have come up with another one, that's great, but don't worry if you don't have to. And the last question is from Ali, and it's, if someone doesn't forgive us, should we pursue forgiveness from them?
If someone doesn't forgive us, say that again.
Should we pursue forgiveness from them?
Well, I kind of find it hard to kind of envisage that scenario, but that sounds like it. The capital of the world, that's what that one is. Thank you very much. That Hemingway story is called The Capital of the World. Yeah, I mean, the big challenge there is how many times should we forgive? 70 times 7. You know, and it is that. I think what you can take comfort from is that acknowledgement and that this is hard. I think that's the main lesson that I've taken from this, that this is hard. It cuts against the grain of our nature, and it's also, and it's extraordinary, difficult thing to achieve, and that it's worth it. They're the things that leap out at me from working on this book. I'll tell you one book that I thought was really amazing, a modern book that I thought was really amazing when I was working on this, John Ronson's So You've Been Publicly Shamed, which deals with that thing of how public all our sins and transgressions are now because of the internet and because of Twitter and social media and stuff like that, and how extreme our desire to punish is now, that we think we're a civilized 21st century society, but that idea of the Twitter mob, Twitter storm, people whose careers are finished over silly little lame jokes. It was very, very salutary and really made me examine my conscience. So I think of all the modern things that I read when I was working on this, that's the most powerful. John Ronson, So You've Been Publicly Shamed. It's an amazing book.
Oh, thank you. And we've got one last question. If forgiveness goes against the grain of our nature, where does that fit?
Oh, wow.
Oh, Ali, you're sending us a great
Oh,
question at the end.
okay, thank you. I'll be thinking about that all night now.
I've got an answer for it.
Okay, brilliant.
Yeah, so
I think you've been muted. Can't hear Virginia.
sorry, I didn't realise I was unmuted, so you didn't hear any of that. I was just going to say that the two things I want to mention are this links to the Eric Lomick story, and it's The Narrow Road to the Deep North.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think this book is anywhere near as hopeful as Eric's book. It's a very, very, very dramatic and really, really painful and harrowing novel, but really worth reading about the road to Burma, and it just takes you through some of the torturers and some of the victims and the tragedy that leaves a central character with. But it is a really good book and very thought-provoking. And I just think at the end, you know, is there room for forgiveness in this story? And I think that's a good question to be left with, because it shows how hard it is. And one that's a little bit more on the hopeful side. Frank and I discovered we both have a mutual love for Marilyn Robinson. And if any of you know Marilyn Robinson, she is just an extraordinary writer of just ordinary good lives. And she's written a series of books around a fictional town called Gilead. And the second book in the series is called Home, and it features a character called Jack Burton, who really is the prodigal son again. But in this case, it's his sister Glory who has to live with their dying father, and then have to put up with Jack coming home having just broken everybody's heart and behaved atrociously, and then having to put up with him coming back into her space later in life. And it's just beautiful. It's a really beautiful retelling of that. So I just would like to thank you all for coming, and I've noticed a few people have left, so they'll be coming again next week. So we look forward to seeing you next week. And this has been recorded, so if you know anybody that would like to catch it, we will share it on probably the DLT channel. I think probably would be the best place to do that. I'd like to thank everybody for, who's helped with this, with Will and David for commissioning it, and thank you, Claire, for doing all the tech support, and thanks most of all to Frank, because this was such a pleasure to edit. It's been such a pleasure to hear all your answers tonight, and it's just, I think it's been just a really great session. So thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
See you next week.
Thank you.